What if the poorest man you've ever seen became the only one who could heal your child? On a blindingly hot afternoon in Savannah, Georgia, a billionaire father looked down from his marble terrace and saw something he could hardly believe, a barefoot stranger spinning like a fool on the manicured lawn, dancing for his paralyzed daughter. The man's clothes were torn, his beard was streaked with gray, his feet bled on the white stones of the path. He didn't come for money, he didn't come for food, he came to make her laugh. And laugh she did. For the first time in years, the little girl's face lit up. Her hands clapped. A sound the mansion had not heard in years, her laughter rose into the air like a hymn. What happened next would challenge everything her father believed about money power and the people he had learned to ignore. And it would unearth a family secret buried deeper than the foundations of his empire. His name was Daniel Brooks. In the glossy neighborhoods of Savannah, few people even looked at him long enough to know it. They called him that drifter, that bum near the bridge, or simply turned their eyes away. But Daniel still remembered who he had been before life broke him. He had once been a construction worker. He had built staircases strong enough to last a century, laid brick in the blazing sun-raised houses for strangers who would never know his name. He had been a husband once and a father for 3 days, until a miscarriage and a departure left him alone with his grief. Jobs dried up, bills stacked up, and soon his rented room became a memory. Now Daniel's life was a rhythm of hunger and small mercies. Nights under the Highway 17 overpass, mornings washing in the public restroom of Forsyth Park. He mended his shirts with fishing line, kept his beard trimmed with a dull pocket knife. Even in rags he tried to stand straight. And despite everything he carried in him, an almost stubborn gentleness. He gave scraps of his sandwich to stray dogs. He carried groceries for women who crossed the street to avoid his smell. When shopkeepers shouted at him to get out, he lifted his hands and stepped back without a word. Somewhere inside, Daniel still believed in dignity. On the day our story begins, Daniel's stomach had been empty since the night before. The humidity clung to his skin like a wet cloth. He had walked from Bay Street all the way to the edge of the wealthy district, an area of historic mansions and newly built palaces on reclaimed marshland. He had never stepped inside one of those gardens. Until now. What drew him was not hunger, but a soundless plea. Through the hedge of the Lawson estate, he had seen a little girl sitting by herself in a wheelchair, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the distance. She looked like someone waiting for a train that would never come. Her name, he would later learn, was Emily Lawson, though to him in that moment she was simply a child who had forgotten how to smile. Daniel recognized that look. He had worn it himself for years, the look of being invisible. Daniel pressed his palm to the iron bars of the back gate. He hesitated. The guards were posted at the front drive, but here at the garden hedge there was only silence and the sound of cicadas. Inside, the girl shifted slightly in her chair. The sun caught the pale streaks in her hair. She looked so small, so solemn, framed by marble paths and clipped hedges. Something in Daniel's chest gave way. He whispered to himself, "I know that pain." Then, almost without deciding, he slipped through the hedge. Twigs snagged his shirt. His bare foot landed on the manicured grass. For the first time in years, he felt like a trespasser, not into wealth, but into a moment that mattered. Emily looked up sharply, startled. Daniel froze, hands raised as if to show he was harmless. Up close, she could see his torn shirt, his sunburned skin, his beard that caught the light like steel wool. He should have looked threatening. Yet his eyes were soft, the way a dog's eyes soften when it hopes for kindness. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I didn't mean to scare you." Emily said nothing. She just stared, her lips pressed into a thin line. Daniel took one step closer, then stopped. He wanted to bow, to kneel, to do anything that would show he was not there to take, but to give. But what did he have? Nothing but his body. his voice, his small store of foolishness. Then he remembered the only thing that had ever worked when he himself felt invisible movement. His body, clumsy and lanky, had once been a dancer's in another life, at weddings, at festivals, at construction site lunch breaks. Movement could still tell a story when words failed. He drew in a breath, bent his knees, and began to sway. Not a practiced dance, but an awkward shuffle, then a ridiculous spin, then a pantomime of slipping on a banana peel. Emily blinked. The corner of her mouth twitched. Daniel flapped his arms like a bird, crossed his eyes, and let himself fall to one knee with an exaggerated groan. He peeked at her from under his arm. She was still watching. So he rolled onto his back, kicked his feet in the air, then sprang up with a clumsy flourish and bowed low as if before a queen. And then impossibly a sound broke from Emily's throat, a tiny giggle, like a bird testing its wings after a storm. Daniel's chest ached. He had not heard that sound in years, not from her, not from any child in such a house. He straightened, eyes damp, and kept going. He would dance himself to exhaustion if it meant keeping that sound alive. Charles Lawson had been called many things, the king of Savannah, shipping the real estate emperor, the man with the Midas touch. To his board of directors he was decisive and brilliant. To his rivals he was merciless. But inside the towering gates of his estate, behind the marble columns and the manicured lawns, he was simply a father drowning in helplessness. At 52, Charles was a man built of angles and habits. His suits were cut sharp, his hair parted with military precision. Every morning at 6:00 a.m., a black sedan took him from the mansion to his downtown office, where he commanded an empire of oil terminals, luxury condos, and port warehouses. His signature could move millions of dollars with a stroke. Yet all that power failed him in the one place he needed it most, the garden where his daughter sat silent. The Lawson mansion was a world of contrasts. Inside the marble foyer, a grand chandelier dripped crystals like frozen rain. A Steinway piano sat silent in the music room. Upstairs, hallways stretched with Persian rugs soft enough to silence footsteps. Outside the gardens, stretched for acres, rose arbors, clipped hedges, a reflecting pool where peacocks sometimes wandered. Charles had built it as a fortress of beauty for his wife and daughter. But now it felt like a mausoleum. His daughter Emily had been the heart of that house. Before the accident, she had run barefoot through the hydrangeas, scattering petals and laughter. Then a drunk driver, a split second of metal and glass, and everything changed. Emily survived. Her mother did not. And Charles's world, built on contracts and control, shattered. He hired the best surgeons in Houston, the most advanced therapists from Boston, experimental robotics from California. Nothing worked. Emily's legs stayed still. Her smile vanished. Her eyes drifted far away. To the world, Charles still looked invincible, jetting to New York, signing deals, posing with senators. But in the quiet hours, he prowled the mansion like a ghost. He stared at the closed door of his daughter's room, wondering if she was lost to him forever. Even his staff moved in whispers. Laughter had been banished from the estate as surely as a thief from a palace. On that blistering afternoon, Charles had just returned from a meeting when he heard a sound so strange, he stopped mid-stride on the marble terrace. It was laughter. His daughter's laughter. For a heartbeat, he thought he had imagined it. Then he heard it again, light trembling, but real. He moved to the railing, peered down into the garden, and saw something impossible. A ragged, barefoot man twirling in the grass, and Emily clapping her hands. Charles's first instinct was fury. How had this man breached his grounds? Where were the guards? Was this some sort of scam? In his world, nothing happened without a motive. People wanted access, power, money. And yet from above, Charles could see the man's movements were ridiculous, even self-mocking. He could see the girl's cheeks flushed with excitement, her posture straighter than he had seen in months, her eyes alive. Charles gripped the iron railing. He had been a man of action all his life, but now he hesitated. His phone was in his pocket. He could summon security with one tap. But the sound rising from the garden stopped him, Emily's laughter ringing like a bell he thought long broken. For the first time in years, hope crept into his chest uninvited. Still, the businessman in him whispered, "Be careful. This man could be dangerous. This could be a trick. His reputation, his daughter's safety, his empire's image, everything could be at risk." He stayed at the railing, eyes fixed on the scene below, torn between instinct and astonishment. What Charles did not yet know was that this trespasser, this nameless vagrant, was about to become the axis on which his entire life would turn. The man who had nothing would soon give him something no money could buy. And before long, Charles would face choices that no boardroom training could prepare him for. For 3 days in a row, Daniel slipped through the hedge. Each time he arrived barefoot, his shirt patched with new stitches, carrying only his worn-out dignity. And each time Emily waited in her wheelchair by the garden path, her small hands gripping the armrests, her eyes flicking toward the hedge like a child waiting for Christmas morning. The garden, once silent as a chapel, now echoed with clumsy dancing and sudden laughter. Daniel twisted his body into pantomimes of old bus drivers, mimicked stray dogs fighting over scraps, or performed slow-motion pratfalls until Emily's cheeks hurt from laughing. Her hands clapped stronger than before, her shoulders lifted straighter. Even her nanny, a stoic woman named Mrs. Harper, began to linger nearby just to watch. But Charles Lawson was no fool. He ordered the guards to check every inch of the estate. He reviewed security footage of the ragged man slipping through the hedge. He called the head of security to his study and demanded answers. "How long has this vagrant been trespassing?" The guard shifted uncomfortably. "Only since last week, sir." "We thought—" "You thought wrong," Charles snapped. "He could be dangerous. He could be casing the property. And my daughter." He stopped, unable to finish. That afternoon, Charles returned early. He stood hidden behind a marble column and watched as Daniel danced for his daughter. Emily clapped and laughed until tears rolled down her cheeks. The sight cut through him like a blade. His daughter hadn't laughed like this in years, yet every instinct told him to end it. He stepped from the shadow, his voice like a crack of thunder. "Stop right there!" Daniel froze mid-spin. His heart slammed against his ribs. Years on the street had taught him the look in Charles Lawson's eyes, cold, assessing, ready to crush. Daniel shifted his weight, prepared to bolt back through the hedge. Emily's voice rang out sharp with panic. "Daddy, please!" Her hands clutched the arms of her wheelchair, knuckles white. "Don't send him away!" Charles's gaze flicked to his daughter. Her eyes were wide, pleading. He saw her hands trembling, her cheeks glowing, her posture upright. Something flickered inside him, confusion, maybe even shame, but his voice stayed hard. "Who are you?" Daniel swallowed. "My name's Daniel Brooks. What are you doing on my property?" "I saw her sitting alone," Daniel said quietly. "She looked so sad. I thought maybe if I danced I could make her laugh." "You could have asked." Daniel's mouth twitched in a humorless smile. "Would you have let me in, sir?" The question hung in the air. Emily's eyes darted between them. Charles stepped closer, studying Daniel up close for the first time, the bare feet scarred from years on concrete, the hollow cheeks of hunger, the quiet steadiness in his eyes. "Do you want money?" Charles asked. "No, sir. I don't want anything. I can leave now if you wish." The words struck Charles in a way he didn't expect. He had heard polished men beg for contracts, lie for favors, flatter for access. This ragged man's words were plain, unadorned, and somehow sincere. Emily's voice broke the silence again. "Daddy, he makes me happy. Please let him stay." Charles looked at his daughter and for the first time noticed something astonishing. Her fingers moved. A tiny shift, barely a twitch, but movement he hadn't seen in months. His chest tightened. His fists loosened. Finally, he exhaled. "You can stay for today," he said slowly, his tone firm but no longer harsh. "But you stay here in the open where I can see you." No misbehavior. Do you understand? Relief washed over Daniel's face. Yes, sir. I understand. Emily clapped her hands, laughter bubbling up again. Showtime, she cried. And just like that, the garden became a stage once more. Yet as Daniel stumbled and spun and Emily laughed with her whole body, Charles stood back with his arms crossed, his heart split in two. He was a man accustomed to control, and here was something he could not command, his daughter's joy given freely by a man who owned nothing. That night Charles sat alone in his study long after the house went quiet. His whiskey glass trembled in his hand. He thought of Daniel's scarred feet, his daughter's glowing cheeks, and the flicker of movement in her fingers. He wondered if he was losing his mind or finally finding his heart. Days became weeks. Every afternoon at precisely 4 o'clock, Daniel walked through the front gate, not sneaking anymore, but admitted by name. The guards nodded respectfully. Mrs. Harper had even begun setting out lemonade. Emily would be waiting in her wheelchair under the shade of the magnolia tree, her eyes scanning for him long before he appeared. With each visit, her laughter grew stronger. Her fingers, once limp, began to twitch in time with his clumsy dance moves. She tried to lift her arms to copy his exaggerated gestures. Sometimes, when she laughed hard enough, her toes shifted, a flicker of life no therapy had sparked in months. Even her doctors began to notice. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it," they said. Charles listened in silence, pride and dread warring in his chest. Daniel, meanwhile, lived like a man who had been handed a second chance. He slept in the staff quarters now, clean sheets, a real pillow, meals twice a day. Yet he still rose early to sweep the back steps, fed the birds, and gave away scraps of food to the stray dogs outside the gate. He never took more than he needed. He never asked for a thing. Charles watched him, quietly puzzled by this man who seemed immune to greed. One evening after Emily had been wheeled back to her room, Charles invited Daniel to sit with him in the garden. For once, there was no performance. The twilight air smelled of jasmine. A single cicada buzzed in the hedge. Charles poured 2 glasses of water and gestured to the stone bench. "Tell me about yourself," Charles said at last. Daniel hesitated. No one had ever asked. His fingers trembled against the glass. "There's not much to tell." "Try me," Charles said softly. And so slowly, Daniel began to speak. He spoke of a small house on the edge of town, of a wife named Caroline, who had lost a pregnancy at 5 months of working 2 and 3 jobs to stay afloat. He spoke of the accident on the construction site that crushed his knee and left him without work for a year, of medical bills that swallowed everything, of eviction papers nailed to the door. He spoke of drifting from shelter to shelter, of falling asleep to the sound of trains, of learning to dance as a way to stay warm and make strangers smile long enough to give him coins. "I didn't start by begging," Daniel said, his voice rough. "I started by moving. People laughed. Sometimes they gave coins, sometimes they cursed. But when I made someone smile, it felt lighter. I didn't feel invisible." Charles sat in silence. He had spent his life surrounded by polished men with perfect resumes. Yet this ragged man's words were more honest than any contract he had ever signed. He thought of Emily's laughter ringing through the garden, of her fingers twitching to life. He thought of all the doctors and specialists and bills and how none of them had brought this miracle. But this man had. Then Daniel said something that knocked the air from Charles's lungs. "I used to work construction on Bay Street condos," Daniel murmured. "The Lawson project back in the early 2000s. You were there one day, big black car blueprints under your arm. I saw you. I laid the foundation of your first building." Charles blinked. He remembered that project, his first big risk, the one that launched his empire. He remembered a tall man with quick hands moving bricks like they weighed nothing. But back then, Daniel had been strong, clean-cut, full of promise. Charles stared now at the scarred feet and hollow cheeks and felt something hot crawl up his throat. You built my foundation?" Charles said slowly. Daniel nodded once. "Guess so. Funny, huh?" Charles looked away, fighting an ache behind his eyes. In the mansion's upper window, he could see Emily's silhouette, her hands pressed to the glass, as she watched them in the garden. His empire had been built on the backs of men like Daniel, and yet here was Daniel giving him something no empire could buy. For the first time in years, Charles reached across the divide. He put a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You're not invisible here," he said quietly. "You never were. I just didn't see you." Daniel's throat tightened. He lowered his head. "Thank you, sir. That night when Emily whispered before bed, 'Daddy Daniel makes me feel like I can move.'" Charles had no answer. He only kissed her forehead and sat in the hallway long after she fell asleep, staring at the man who had laid his foundation and now might be laying the foundation for something far more important, his daughter's healing. Outside, the magnolia leaves trembled in the warm breeze. A new chapter was beginning, though none of them yet knew how deep the next revelation would cut. The second miracle came on a rainy Thursday, when thunder rolled far out over the marsh and the magnolias spilled their sweet perfume into the open halls. Emily had finished therapy early. Daniel had turned the handrails into a parade left-right march salute until she was laughing too hard to stand. Mrs. Harper wheeled her to the study to rest. Charles was at a meeting downtown. The house felt quiet, suspended like a held breath. "Stay with me," Emily said, reaching for Daniel's sleeve. "I'm not going anywhere," he answered. Mrs. Harper, who had served this family since before Emily was born, hesitated at the door. Her face held a storm of its own. "There's something I should show you both," she said, voice low. "Something Mrs. Lawson left behind." She crossed to the bookcase and pressed a hidden latch. A narrow panel clicked. Behind it sat a cedar box, worn smooth by time. She set it on the desk, lifted the lid, and drew out a leather-bound journal and a small silver locket. Emily's breath caught. Mama's box. Mrs. Harper opened the journal to a page marked with a ribbon. The handwriting swam and steadied, looping patient her mother's hand. She began to read. "If anything happens to me and the house grows quiet, find the man who dances." Years ago, when I volunteered at the supper line by the river, there was a young construction worker who would make the children laugh between shifts. He said movement kept him warm when the winter cut through his coat. His name was Danny Brooks. He had a kindness the world didn't deserve. If the day ever comes when our child forgets how to smile, find him. He will know how to give laughter back. No one spoke. Rain tapped at the windows soft as fingers. Mrs. Harper handed the locket to Emily. Inside was a tiny photo, a younger Daniel clean-shaven, laughing with a paper crown on his head, while two kids clung to his arms at the church shelter. He was mid-twirl. Even in the fading silver, joy radiated from him like light. Emily looked up slowly. "It's you," she whispered. "Mama knew you." Daniel's throat clenched. "I volunteered there on Saturdays. Your mother ran the coat drive. She was kind to everyone. I never knew her married name." Mrs. Harper turned another page. A second entry. The ink was darker here, words written fast. "Charles says we should avoid the Bay Street site this week. Too much pressure from the bank, too many corners cut by suppliers. He hates admitting it, but I can see the worry in his mouth. I told him safety first. Always safety first." Mrs. Harper looked at Daniel. "You worked Bay Street?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Until the day the lift failed. Brake cable snapped. My knee never came back after that." She kept reading, voice taking on a tremor. "We drove that route today." Emily sang in the back. "At the intersection by the port, a truck cut too close. I felt the brakes stutter. Charles swore he'd replace the lot, every faulty line, every cheap part that slipped past inspection. He promised." Emily's fingers tightened around the locket. "Mrs. Harper? Was the accident? Was it the brakes?" Mrs. Harper closed the journal. "There's more your father needs to say, not me." The door opened. Charles stood in the threshold, rain on his coat, color drained from his face. He had heard the last question. For a long moment, he simply looked at them, at the journal, at the locket in Emily's hand, at Daniel's stunned profile, and the life he had built pressed down on him like a cathedral. "Emily," he said, voice unsteady, "there are truths I should have told you earlier." He crossed the room and set his phone on the desk. A video glowed to life, a deposition time stamped 2 years ago. A supplier's foreman swore under oath that brake lines from a low-bid contract had failed, quality checks had been flagged, had still been installed to keep the schedule. A name from accounting appeared. A quiet settlement. No admission. No headlines. Charles stopped the video. His jaw trembled. The truck that clipped your mother's car came off that same route. That same batch. I fired people. I paid out claims. I told myself I'd made it right. His eyes lifted to Daniel, but I did not go back far enough. I did not go back to the men at the foundation. To you. Silence filled the room, heavy and sacred. Emily's small hand searched the air for her father's. He took it. Daniel stood very still, as if a beam had been placed across his shoulders, and he meant to keep carrying it. "I should have closed that site when your mother warned me," Charles said. "I should have halted deliveries. I should have stopped trusting signatures and trusted what I knew was true. I failed her. I failed you." His eyes slid to Daniel. "And I failed you years before that when the cable snapped and a man who built my first building lost his living. I signed the check. I did not learn the name. You laid my foundation, and I never saw your face." Daniel's voice came slow, careful. "I did not come here to hurt you, sir, or to dig up grief. I came because a child looked like I used to look. Lost." Charles lowered his head. "You came to give what I could not buy." He sank to his knees beside Emily's chair, this man the city called a king, and pressed his forehead to the blanket on her lap. His shoulders began to shake, not with the polished tears of public sorrow, with the raw, private grief of a father who can no longer pretend he controlled the story. Emily's hand touched his hair. "Daddy," she whispered, voice steady like a small bell. "We're here now." Mrs. Harper, who had watched a lifetime of triumphs and funerals in this house, stepped back to the door and drew it nearly closed, giving them a room that felt for once like a chapel. Thunder rolled again. The rain softened. Daniel looked at the handrails in the corner. He spoke as if to the air. "Emily, can you try something for me?" She nodded. Tears still clung to her lashes, but a light had kindled behind them. Mrs. Harper wheeled her to the rails. Charles rose, wiped his face, and took his place on one side. Daniel stood on the other. Only counting, Daniel said, "No pushing, no pulling, just you." Emily gripped the wood. Her fingers stronger now from weeks of clapping, wrapped and held. She set her jaw, drew a breath, her arms straightened, her hips lifted. The chair eased back an inch as her weight shifted forward. "1," Daniel whispered. "2," Charles said, voice breaking. Her knees trembled. She fought for balance. Sweat beaded at her temple. The rails creaked softly. 3, Mrs. Harper breathed from the doorway. Emily rose. She did not rise high. She did not rise long. But she rose. And then, slow as sunrise, she moved her right foot forward. It slid a few inches. The smallest step. A step all the same. The sound that followed was not applause, not a cheer. It was a deep, collective exhale, the letting go of years of fear in one breath. Charles's hand hovered, but he did not touch her. Daniel's palm lifted, but he did not steady her. Emily stood trembling between them, deciding her own balance, writing a new sentence inside her body. She sank back into the chair chest, heaving cheeks wet and radiant. "I did it," she whispered. "Daddy, I did it." Charles laughed, a raw, astonished sound. He kissed the top of her head. "You did it." Daniel closed his eyes. In the dark behind his lids, he saw a small photo in a silver locket. A younger man with a paper crown. A woman smiling at him from the coat drive. A note in a journal, find the man who dances. He opened his eyes. There's one more thing, he said, turning to Charles. You can't change the past, but you can change the story other families live tomorrow. Charles met his gaze. Something resolved there, like steel cooling to shape. We will, he said. We'll pull every contract that cuts a corner. We'll rebuild what we broke. We'll start with Bay Street, with names, not case numbers. Rain brightened the window glass. The room felt wider, as if its walls had learned how to breathe. Emily lifted the locket and pressed it to her heart. Mama found him, she said softly. We found him. Daniel smiled. Your mother wrote the first step, he said. You just took the next. They sat together in the quiet, the kind that does not smother, but blesses. And in that quiet, the house that had been a mausoleum began to sound again like a home, the soft rhythm of rain, the slow thump of a proud father's heartbeat, the calm breath of a child who had chosen hope. Autumn came early that year. The marsh grasses turned the color of old gold and the magnolias traded bloom for leaf. In the mornings, you could hear gulls calling from the river. In the afternoons, you could hear music again in the Lawson house. Not a piano. Not yet. It was the rhythm of rails, the soft count of steps, the quiet chorus of people trying together. Emily learned to stand without the tremble taking over. Some days she took one sure step. Some days she only practiced her grip and her breath. Daniel never rushed her. Charles never bargained with time. They had learned each in their own way that patience is not weakness. It is a kind of courage. The lawyers came and went. Contracts were audited. Corners that had been shaved thin as paper were rebuilt in steel. Names were written down. Checks were cut, but so were habits. Charles stood in hard rooms and said harder words, I was wrong. He did not add the word but. He did not ask to be thanked. He watched other men stare at their shoes and felt the floor of his life settle a little closer to true. On a Sunday afternoon, after the air cleared from a morning storm, Daniel wheeled Emily out to the garden path. She wore a blue scarf her mother had once tied for her. He wore a clean work shirt that still surprised him when he caught his reflection in the glass. Ready, Daniel asked. Emily smiled. Count slow. She stood. One breath, then another. She moved her right foot, then her left. Small steps. Real steps, the kind only a body can earn. When she sat back, Charles did not clap. He simply knelt and pressed his forehead to her hands, and for a moment the world was exactly the size of 3 people and a promise. Later, when the light went amber and the shadows grew long, Emily turned the locket in her palm. Dad, she said, what if we start a place where people like Daniel are not invisible? A place for therapy and work and dignity. For families like ours. For families we do not know yet. Charles looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Emily. The wind lifted the edge of the blue scarf. What would you do? Would you forgive a man who failed you and then changed? Would you open your gates to the person the world taught you to fear? In the end, is family about blood or about the hands that help you stand? If you want me to polish any section, add dialogue for TTS pacing, or write a thumbnail script and title set, say revise and tell me which part.